that view. I wouldn't hold that particular view, but that certainly is a view that's held. Okay, any other possibilities? Jan?
After God created the earth, before he created Adam and Eve.
Okay, well, that's a possibility too.
He was in the garden as a fallen creature.
Okay. Okay, but was he in the garden before God created man?
We don't know.
Well, at least, okay, we don't have any clear examples that he was, correct? Okay. Kathy, do you want to modify that at all, or?
I was just going to say during the creation week sometime.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. During the creation week, did God create absolutely everything that he created? Some people do believe the angels were created before the creation of the world, but the thing is, the opening chapter of Genesis does seem to refer to an absolute creation of everything outside of God. Okay, as far as there was in the beginning, was God basically, and then God created the heavens and the earth, and he created time and material and everything else. But typically, it is generally believed that the angels were created also during the creation week, when it says that God created the heavens and the earth, and then it begins to focus on the earth and expanding the earth. I know Meredith Klein, for one, believes that when it says God created the heavens and the earth, he was talking about the spiritual heavens where God dwells, and the earth. And then when it says the earth was formless and void, that those next several days of the creative work of God is shaping the earth or the lower realm, but that the heavens referred to in the very opening is referring to the spiritual heavens, and that's certainly possible. But listen, if God created all things in that creation week, including heaven and including the angels, is there anything that that indicates at the end of that week that there was no fall yet? Jan? God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, if that's the case, and if the angels were created also during that time frame, remember, the angels are not eternal, they're created beings as well, then at the end of the creation week, all was well. Okay? There was no rebellion yet. And we do find, actually, in these passages I'm going to read, we find that Satan actually was in Eden, and he was on the mountain of God. And remember that God created Eden in order to put the man, and he put the man in the garden and so forth. So it appears, at least for some time perhaps, and probably not a long time, that Satan and his angels were in Eden. I should say not Satan, but Lucifer at that time, because that was his name prior to his fall, was in the garden on the mountain with the Lord and with the holy angels and so forth, because the mountain basically represents heaven. And Eden, of course, is the sanctuary of God. See, heaven and earth are together at that time, and it's sin that brings about that separation of paradise from the earth. Does that make sense? Remember how Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." Paradise was now no longer on the earth once sin took place, and Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. God, as it were, withdrew because the creation comes under the curse. And who knows, maybe that was the creation of the heavens when he withdrew from the earth. We're not told specifically. But if God created the angels during the creation week, at the end of the creation week, they still had not fallen. Okay? But shortly after that, very shortly after that, they fell. Because how long were Adam and Eve in the garden? 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years? How long were they in the garden? Does anybody remember a good argument that they were not there for very long? I'll try Kathy, okay? Right. Eve had not conceived, okay, prior to the end of the probation, and there was nothing wrong with Eve, and procreation was not a sin. As a matter of fact, the Lord, when he created them, said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth," which means that was something they were supposed to do right away. Now, that means that Eve probably would have conceived first time around, I would imagine. There wouldn't have been any difficulty with that, which means that they were probably in the garden for less than a month, okay? Because Eve had not conceived by the time Satan enters the garden and tempts them and they fall. The first conception takes place after the fall. And that's, sort of I would say that's I'm not sure you could really refute that argument, could you? I think they were in there for a very short period of time. But that also means that Satan and his angels fell just shortly after the creation week was complete. Okay? And I think we get something of that in these verses. Okay? Especially in the second passage, but let me read the Isaiah 14 passage first. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. Here's the first indication of what the sin was that caused Lucifer to fall, and that was pride. He wanted to exalt his throne above that of God, because we find in the second passage that Lucifer was probably the greatest creation of God, the greatest of the angels that he made, and he was corrupted by reason of his greatness, his wisdom, and his beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. The ruby, the topaz, and the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald, and the gold. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the days you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. By the abundance of your trade you were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you. So the idea here is that, notice he says you were in Eden, and you were on the mountain of God, and you were cast as profane from the mountain. I've mentioned this before, but in the context of the Garden of Eden and the creation week and what takes place afterwards in the fall of man, how does the serpent get into the garden? Well, he's cast off the mountain, and the mountain happens to be in the midst of the garden. So you have heaven and earth are together. On earth you have God's presence with his angels on this mountain that's in Eden, which is the paradise of God. Satan is cast off the mountain. First thing he does is he goes about to try to destroy the work that God has created, which is that man and his plan for man, because his plan for man was greater than his plan for the angels. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, one other thing that Edwards believed was the reason why Satan rebelled, and the reason why the angels rebelled with him. We already talked about elect angels and non-elect angels. What was the cause of the rebellion? Well, we already saw that Lucifer became very prideful by the reason of his beauty, but what is it that set him off? Edwards believes that God revealed to them, and this is speculation, but it's quite possible, that God revealed to them the reason why he made them. And what was the reason why God made the angels? I mean, they do guard his holiness, and they are his messengers and so forth, but what specifically do they do? The author to the Hebrews contrasts the Son with the angels. And
Minister to those who will receive salvation.
okay, they are the ministers to those who will receive salvation. That's right. Which means that God created the angels with all their splendor and wisdom and beauty and power in order to be servants to creatures that, in their estimation and actually in reality, were far less than they were. Okay? Now, picture yourself, or don't picture yourself this way, but picture Satan, picture Lucifer, the greatest of these created beings in beauty and wisdom. He's being told that he was created and given all of this glory and power in order that he might serve mankind. Now, he wants to exalt his throne above God. The idea of becoming a servant to these creatures much less than him is what Edwards believes was the cause of his rebellion, and the cause also of the angels that rebelled, somehow believing that they had some hope of overcoming God. I mean, that just shows foolishness, actually. It doesn't seem as though they really understood God. They really would have no possible chance of overcoming him. But the idea is that was the occasion. They fell, and in their fall they lost, of course, were stripped of all that which makes any creature truly beautiful, and that is the holiness that they had. And holiness consists in the love of what is good and right, and they lost that entirely, and they have only now love for what is evil, and they hate what is good. Okay, I think also from what we see in this description of the dragon, let's see, is it in this place we see? Yeah. In verse 3, that he has 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. Do we see this creature anywhere else in the book of Revelation? This dragon with 7 heads? Can you think of a place, Brian? Okay, but what is the example we have? What is the creature doing? I mean, I guess there's several places where it appears, but I'm thinking of one in particular where there's actually a person sitting on the dragon. Who sits on the dragon? The harlot. Okay, and who is the harlot? From what we've seen so far. Okay, Israel. Yes, Israel is the harlot. The reason being that the harlot is Babylon. Babylon is the one that's become the place of all the unclean spirits. Babylon is the one that's drunk with the blood of the saints. Babylon is called the great city, and Egypt and Sodom, which is the place where the Lord was crucified, is also called the great city. So Jerusalem has become like Sodom, like Egypt, like Babylon, which are the three worst, nations, as it were, cities, capitals, and so forth, that represent the enemies of God. Okay, that's what Israel has become, the enemy of God. And who is it that is underlying that? Who is the one who is behind that? It's the beast with the 7 heads, which is Satan. So basically what Jesus said to the Jewish leaders, we see it symbolized here in John 8:44. You are of your father the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. So basically, Satan is the one behind the rebellion of Israel against the Lord, which is why I believe the harlot is represented as sitting upon the beast. By the way, the beast also represents Rome. And is there a problem with having the beast underlying the woman as well as, let's say, representing Rome? Remember the 7 heads or 7 hills and so forth? Satan is also the controlling power behind Rome. And the rest of the world, it's a rebellion against God. And just because he causes these 2 nations to fight against one another, to destroy each other, doesn't mean they're not both Satan's and under his power. When you have nations fighting today, do we say, well, one is is on the good side and the other is on the bad, No, we got 2 bad sides fighting, not always, but often. So he's the power behind Rome, and certainly he was also, as I mentioned before, since the dragon is represented here as waiting for the woman to give birth so that he might devour the child when it's born, certainly that represents the persecution that he brought against, actually when he tried to kill Christ after he was born. Remember how Herod sent the armies to kill all the children that are 2 years, all the male children 2 years and younger, because he wanted to try to kill Christ. Okay, well, moving on to page 3, the male child is Christ. Verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So the Messiah is the one who comes out of the faithful in ethnic Israel. I mean, the true church are ethnic Israelites. They are, racially, they're children of Abraham. But they are also the faithful among them. Okay? And through his work of redemption, obviously, he is rewarded with the exaltation to the right hand of God, from where he rules over the nations with a rod of iron. We see that, again, the imagery being pulled from the Old Testament in Psalm chapter 2, verses 8 through 12. We see the exaltation of the Messiah and his reign, and how the kings of the earth are called upon to submit to him. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he not become angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. By the way, the child who ascends to heaven, who sits at the began And there was a pause in the war in order for the 144,000 to be protected. How, I think it was Vespasian who was marching toward Jerusalem, and then Nero committed suicide. And so there was civil war in Rome, and that caused Vespasian to have to stop until he found out who the next Caesar would be, and how he went back to Rome, but then he sent Titus, his son, to go to Jerusalem, and then that's when the siege took place. There was that space of time that allowed the Jews to get away, or at least the faithful Christian Jews to get away, those who had listened to Jesus. Anyway, they're protected during that whole space of time, during the whole 1,260 days, which is the time frame of the Jewish war. Now we move on to, that seemed like the simplest section. Now we move on to the next part, which I think is referring to pretty much the same thing, only giving to us a little bit more focus on what's happening up in heaven during this time, once Christ ascends. We see that there is war in heaven, and Satan is cast out of heaven. That sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? Wasn't Satan cast out a long time ago? What's going on here? Can you, let me ask you this question. Satan fell, and the angels, the third of the angels, whatever, fell with him, right, in his rebellion. But has Satan visited heaven since that time? Okay. Satan apparently had access to heaven. How do we know that? Okay, the book of Job, right? The book of Job, where the sons of God came to present themselves before God, and Satan was with them. And Satan begins to accuse Job and so forth. So apparently God allowed Satan to come to heaven. He's the accuser of the brethren. And where does he accuse them? From earth, speaking towards God, this person did that, this person did this. No, he's in God's presence, actually, accusing the brethren. Okay? But it appears as though there is a time when Satan was actually cast down out of heaven and not allowed access any further. And I think that probably has something to do with his being locked into the abyss. Okay? And it has to do with this war in heaven. Jerry, do you have a question?
Thinking that the Great Commission, after the disciples overturned, didn't Christ say he beheld Satan fall?
Yes, we're going to actually look at that in just a moment. Okay, so Satan, we know, was cast down because of Christ's ministry. Okay? And we have several indications of that. For instance, Matthew 12, 28 through 29, which I believe is again representing what we see in the angel coming down from heaven, grabbing hold of Satan and locking him into the abyss. Remember what Jesus says in defense of his ministry before the Jewish leaders who were accusing him of being in league with Satan. He says, "But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Or how can anyone enter the strong man's house and carry off his property unless he first binds the strong man? And then he will plunder his house." So the idea is that Christ could not be doing what he was doing unless he had first bound Satan in some way. So here is one indication of the binding of Satan during Christ's ministry. And then the one that Jerry was quoting in Luke 10, verses 17 through 20, when Christ had sent the 70 out to teach and to preach the gospel, the result was Satan falling like lightning out of heaven. The 70 returned with joy, saying, "Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name." And he said to them, "I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will injure you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven." Now, the idea here seems to be that Christ in his work, and especially as the gospel goes forward, there is this defeat of Satan and his demons. I think it has something to do with what we see next. I think I have this quote next. Let me just check. No, it isn't next. But when it talks about the exaltation of Christ, and I have it a little bit later on, it talks about how he's exalted above every principality and power and so forth. It seems as though this isn't just perhaps the good angels that are ruling on behalf of God, but also the fallen angels that had some measure of authority. Satan and his angels are cast down from that place, from heaven, and they are cast down to the earth because of Christ's ministry. Okay, so the idea here is that Christ, during the time of his coming into the world, Satan is ready to try to destroy him when he's born. But he ends up being destroyed by him. And that's simply to fulfill what was prophesied as early on as Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the curse upon the serpent. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. Here we have Christ on his cross, crushing the head of the serpent, and throwing him down to the earth. Okay. Now, that is what Gentry believes, and a number believe is what's going on next when it shows this war. Okay, now we have this, Satan trying to stop Christ. He fails. Christ is exalted to heaven. The next thing we see is that there's war in heaven, with Michael and his angels actually fighting against the devil and his angels. And the question is, what's going on here? What is this war, and why is this war suddenly taking place with Christ's ascension? Well, if the second group are correct, it's because it's Christ who is fighting against Satan and his angels once he ascends into heaven. And he's basically, at that point, throwing them out, purging heaven of their presence, casting them down to the earth. And that's one of the reasons why you have what you see going on during the book of Acts, and I suppose what you see going on even after AD 70. Satan is cast out of heaven. He knows he has but a short time. He's trying to do everything he can to drag as many people as he can into hell with him or destroy God's works. But he is still only on a chain and only allowed to do what God allows him to do. But this war with Michael and the angels in heaven, casting Satan down out of heaven, would be basically the same thing represented by the angel who grabs Satan and locks him into the abyss. It's Satan being subjected, as it were, being defeated. Okay? So let's ask the question, well, actually maybe we shouldn't ask the question because now we're only 3 minutes away. I'm not going to be able to get through all of this. Sorry, so maybe we should stop there. In the past, I would just keep on going, and then I'd have to try to struggle through the morning service, having spoken for an hour and 20 minutes, and that's kind of hard to do. So let me stop there, and let me ask you if there's any questions. Okay, any questions on any of that? Brigida? I'm sorry, the what? Okay, were there any questions, any comments? Jerry, did you have one?
I thought I read earlier, well, at least certain angels were created for the heirs of salvation. Is that true? Did I actually see that?
Well, we were talking about how the angels are ministering spirits sent out to render service to those who will inherit salvation. That comes from Hebrews chapter 1. That tells us what God's purpose was behind the creation of the angels. He created them actually to be servants. He gave them all that power and wisdom that they might serve those who would inherit salvation. The thing we looked at before was Edwards' speculation, which is probably correct, that declaration after God had created man, he had already created the angels, and then he creates man, and then he reveals to the angels the purpose of their creation is to serve man. And that may have been the occasion of Satan's fall because of his pride and so forth.
Well, it's interesting because this all happened before the fall of man.
Actually, it would happen before the fall of man. Right. After the creation week, before the fall of man. Did you find that part? You're looking for Bridget. Okay, you're looking at last week's... The Idumeans, as far as I know, were the descendants of Esau, and somehow they were involved in wanting to take over because, there's enmity between the two races and so forth. They were wanting to create havoc, kill, destroy, and that was happening just around the same time as the AD 70 and the thing that was happening with Rome. And the Zealots also were, let's see, I'm trying to remember now what the Zealots were about. All I know is that right now off the top of my head is that both of them had a common enemy, and it was the Jews. And we looked at their involvement in connection with the judgment that God was bringing upon the Jews, and how with the, excuse me, with the, I think it, well, let's see, with the measuring of the temple, when it talked about in chapter 11, verse 13, in that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell, and 7,000 people were killed, and so forth, that that was representative of the, well, we saw several quotes indicating that in that seventh decade of the first century, which would be around AD 70, in that time frame, there was a lot of storms and earthquakes and things like that. And as a matter of fact, it was storming, and there were earthquakes on the night that the Idumeans and the Zealots both worked together to kill the temple guard and to get into the temple. And through their attack at that particular time, several thousand people were killed. So we were just simply aligning that event with what took place here, with the earthquake and a tenth of the people falling and so many thousands of people dying and so forth, just to show us that there was actually a literal, or it could have been a literal fulfillment of that very thing. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, then let's have a word of prayer, and we'll take a break before the morning service. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the opportunity to study the book of Revelation. And Lord, we do by asking if there are any questions about what we were looking at last week with regard to the temple and the two prophets. I think you'll recall that there was a certain portion of the temple that was measured and a certain portion of the temple that wasn't measured, because it was being left outside of God's protection in order to be trampled underfoot by the nations for quite, I guess, some time. But the idea was that the Lord was protecting His true church while He is giving the earthly temple over to be destroyed because, again, of His wrath against Israel. We also saw the two prophets and how they prophesied for 1,260 days, and we considered that perhaps the two prophets were a contingency of Christians that were left inside the city during the time of the siege and also during the time of the war. We also considered that they might have been perhaps two particular individuals, as James Stuart Russell believed in his book, The Parousia, believing that James was there, the brother, at least the half-brother of the Lord, one of the natural children of Joseph and Mary, that represented basically Old Testament piety. He was the one who represented the law, while Peter was the one who represented the prophetic element, as he was the chief of the apostles. And together they made up, as it were, the New Testament testimony of the gospel, even as in the Old Testament it was Moses and Elijah pointing to Christ. In this case it's James and Peter who are declaring Christ to these who have rejected Him, and how they were killed and then raised and ascended and so forth. Well, if there aren't any questions on that, we'll go to the next section, which has to do with the woman and the dragon. This is perhaps the easiest part of the book to understand. It seems to be the clearest part. And I think it fits in very well with the time frame that we are looking at, which is the Jewish war, the time of God's judgment against Israel for her unfaithfulness, for her rejecting of the Messiah. The Lord is putting her aside and so forth. We see in this section how the devil is involved in this persecution against the Jewish nation, against ethnic Israel. And we really shouldn't think it's strange, because Satan really, not only does he want to destroy the church, he also wants to destroy all mankind. And he even uses one portion of mankind to destroy another portion of mankind, even if those two parts, those two portions, may already be his slaves, as it were, under his power in the kingdom of darkness and so forth. Satan doesn't really take care of his own. He wants to destroy them as well as anyone else in order to drag them, of course, into hell. Well, in this section we find that the Lord is using Satan to persecute, I believe. Well, actually what he's doing is he's protecting his church from Satan's persecution. but he's using Satan to bring judgment against his people, or at least his former people who rejected him. So let's look at Revelation 12, and let me just go ahead and read the 17 verses as we get started. Beginning in verse 1, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain, to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she might be nourished for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. And the dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon who was thrown down, the serpent of old who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even to death. For this reason rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. And the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, in order that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time, from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. I just want to remind you, as we begin to look at this section, that we are looking at a vision. It has a visionary language, and we don't need to find one-to-one correspondence with what actually takes place. Otherwise, you basically have the woman giving birth, the dragon fails to gobble up the child, and so forth. The dragon opens its mouth, a torrent of water comes out. I mean, things like that didn't happen. However, what it represents did take place. Now, I'm sure you've wrestled with this text before and perhaps have come to some conclusions. Does anyone have any idea who the woman is in this prophecy, in this vision? Brian? Okay, the nation of Israel, possibly. Okay. Kathy? Okay, the true church, or we might want to modify this, is actually both, except the true church is actually closer. It's talking about, I believe, that faithful remnant within Israel, okay? Because they are the ones through whom the Lord brings his, of course, his Messiah, and I think there's no secret as to who the child is, right? Okay, the child is Christ, and as far as the dragon, who is the dragon? Satan is the dragon, that's right. Okay, now first of all, let's consider the time frame of what's going on here. I do believe, as we've had in other places in the book of Revelation, and by the way, we are relating these events to the time frame around AD 70, and actually the book of Revelation keeps cycling between his first coming in his incarnation and his coming in judgment, which is very similar to his second coming. And it also goes between his first coming and his second coming, where he actually does come in judgment at the end of the world. I don't think we've run into one of those sections yet, unless the end of chapter 11 may have something to do with that. It almost seems as though it goes between one to the other, one to the other, one to the other, and then one to the distant other, and then it may, go from one to the other and then to the distant again, and finally from one to the distant other. It just seems like you have this telescoping effect in the book of Revelation, as you also have in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. That's one of the things that makes it difficult to know where to separate the events. And also the reason why you have people like Stuart Russell. What's his first name again? Is it James Stuart Russell? Yeah. Who believes that all eschatology has been fulfilled because those events seem to be tied so closely together. Okay, but anyway, at this particular juncture, we are backing up again to the first coming of Christ. And we're talking here about the woman who is laboring to have a child. She gives birth to the child. Satan is there ready to gobble up the child. He fails to do so. I mean, doesn't that sound familiar according to the New Testament Gospels, where when Christ was born, of course, Satan did what he could to try to destroy the child before the child could destroy him. So this is backing up again to show us how the Lord is protecting the woman from satanic persecution. And in essence, we're talking about the faithful remnant in Israel, the 144,000 again, just using a different image. Okay. It begins with the birth of Christ. In verse 5, I think it's quite clear, she gave birth to a son, a male child. It certainly includes his ministry, his death, and his resurrection and ascension. That's all sort of included from the time of his birth to what we also see in verse 5. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Okay, so that represents that whole time frame of his birth and his ministry and so forth. And it includes Christ's ministry through the book of Acts, as well as what continues beyond the book of Acts in verse 5, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Remember, as soon as he ascended, he began that rule over all the nations, and that rule will end when all of his enemies are subdued under his feet, and he comes again to bring an end to human history, to raise the dead and gather them all together for the judgment. We saw that in the section on eschatology, or at least that particular part of the eschatology. And then this section concludes with the Jewish war and the destruction of Jerusalem. Look at verse 6. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And I believe it's referring to the same thing that verse 14 is referring to. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. By the way, you know that dispensationalism looks at the book of Revelation and considers the time frame to be how long? Brenton? 7 years, right. And how do you get 7 years out of the book of Revelation? Well, here's one place where you might feasibly do that. You have a time frame of 1,260 days. How many months is 1,260 days in Jewish terms? We've already looked at that once. Brian? 42 months, and 42 months comes out to how many years? 3.5 years. Now, what about time, times, and half a time? What does that mean? Time and times, and in half a time, you have 3.5 years again. Okay, so you have this 3.5 year recurring time frame. Do we stack them up and call it 7? Why would we want to put those together and call them 7, or why would they want to do that? Where do they get the 7 years? Do they get it from the book of Revelation? I mean, you could take these time frames, and as dispensationalism likes to do, they like to make a distinction whenever there is a distinction. I mean, why 1,260 days? Why 3.5 years, time, times, and half a time, 42 months? Are those all different time frames? You could just stack them all together and come up with a longer time frame, right? But why 7 years? Donna? The book of Daniel, okay, and the 70th week of Daniel in particular, right? They believe the 69 weeks have been fulfilled. The 70th week was put on hold because the Jews rejected their Messiah when he presented himself as king. So that 7 years is in the future, so they find the 7 years by stacking up a couple of these different time frames. But actually, this time frame is really, except for some variations, as we saw with the two witnesses, they actually began their testimony before the Jewish war, and they were killed before the end of the Jewish war, but the time frame was still 1,260 days. That is, if if those two characters are James and Peter. If it's a contingency of Christians still inside the city during that time, it could have been exactly identical with that time frame. But the time frame is really 3.5 years that the book of Revelation deals with. And actually, the war of the Jews with Rome lasted for 3.5 years. Okay? There is another time frame also that we saw in the book of Revelation. It was 5 months. And that 5 months happens to be the length of time that Jerusalem was under siege before they fell. Okay. Alrighty, so those are the time frames. And what we have here in verses 6 and 14 are the same thing. The woman flees into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God so that she be nourished for 1,260 days. And then we have 2 wings of the great eagle given to the woman so she could fly into the wilderness. You know, whether she ran or whether she flew, it doesn't matter. You see, it's just the imagery that she got out of there. And she went into the wilderness, and she was protected by God. But the time frame is the 1,260 days of the time times and half time, which is the 3.5 years, which is the time frame of the Jewish war. Okay, so we're backing up to the first coming of Christ, but we've moved already forward into this time at the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish war again. Now, I've already asked you the question, who is the woman? Okay, the woman is Israel. The woman is believing Israel. The woman is not ethnic Israel, because ethnic Israel is the one that's coming under God's judgment, right? Verses 1 and 2, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Now this imagery, as I also mentioned before, that a great deal of the imagery of the book of Revelation is taken straight out of the Bible. And this particular one comes from the Old Testament, from the dream that Joseph had that made his brothers really like him, you know. I'm just being facetious, the one that made them hate him. And that was the one that he had about the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars all bowing down to him. Genesis 37, verses 9 through 10. Now he had still another dream, and related it to his brothers, and said, Lo, I have had still another dream. And behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. He related it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? You see how that imagery is used to refer to the nation of Israel. But we believe it's a little bit more specific because this woman is the one that's actually protected by God as she flees to the wilderness, as she flies to the wilderness. Israel did not fly to the wilderness, at least not ethnic Israel. But the true Israel did, right? Because the true Israel are those who actually trust in the Lord. Like Abraham. If they have the faith of Abraham, then they are children, like Isaac, children of promise. Okay? Now, it just so happens that Christ did come out of the faithful line of Israel. He was born of the Virgin Mary. And why is it that Joseph and Mary were chosen to be the parents of Christ? Was it because they were just Israelites? You know, why is it that Zachariah was chosen, or Zacharias, I guess, was chosen and his wife Elizabeth to have John? It's because they happened to be believing Old Testament saints. There were a lot of unbelieving Old Testament saints, but the Lord put these things within the household of the believing Israelites because they are the true Israel. Okay, so obviously this woman is representing believing Israel. The red dragon is, of course, Satan, verses 3 and 4. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was to give birth, or who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Okay, let's take a look at who this image is referring to. I think clearly it's referring to the devil. As you know, he's called a serpent. He's called a dragon. Red is a color often used for Satan because he is described as the red dragon, the great red dragon, and so forth. But we see him actually identified in verse 9 of this text. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who was called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So I don't think there's any question that that's referring to the devil. And also, you'll recall that in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 2, which we considered earlier on in the section on eschatology, Satan is bound, but he is called here the dragon. And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. By the way, it just occurs to me, but let me ask you a question. Who is the angel here? Who is the angel that takes hold of Satan and binds him, at least from this perspective? You might have differences of opinion here, but what's that? Okay, it's the Lord Jesus Christ, right? Now, in just a few moments, we're going to look at a war that takes place in heaven where Michael and his angels are fighting against the dragon and his angels, and he's cast down to the earth, okay? Now, do you think there's any similarity between these two events? Actually, it may be referring to the same event, especially when we consider that Michael is an angel who is fighting with Satan. Here's another angel who takes hold of Satan and locks him into the abyss, as it were. He defeats him, okay? We're going to consider who Michael is in just a few moments, too. Okay. Now, I believe that this, what we've just read, represents his rebellion in heaven that resulted in the fall of 1/3 of the angels. You've perhaps wondered how many good angels are there, how many bad angels, how many elect angels, how many fallen angels. It's believed that this passage here gives us the ratio of elect angels to fallen angels, when it says that the dragon took 1/3 of the stars and swept them down to the earth and so forth. That in his rebellion in heaven, he actually caused the fall of 1/3 of the angels, and those would be the angels that were not elect. In Scripture, the good angels are called the elect angels. Does anybody know why they're called elect angels? Brian saw a hand move. That's okay. Why are the holy angels called the elect angels? Okay. Well, now we have some curiosity piqued. That's good. Anybody have a guess? Well, who else is elect in the Bible? Oh wait, Donna's going to guess.
Well, if we correlate that with God's elect people, those angels were chosen not to rebel, but to be in his presence always.
Oh.
That's what they're chosen by God to do that.
Okay.
Others
All right, that's correct. The elect angels are those who were chosen by God to always be in his presence, that is, not to fall. And the non-elect angels are the ones who fell, okay? Now, there's a sense, I mean, it makes sense because you consider this, that there's a difference between angels and men in really one very important respect. What is it that angels don't do, and what is it that men do? What is the difference between them? I mean, we have physical bodies or spirits, but yes, Brian?
Sin.
Well, some of them did sin, right? So some of them, it wouldn't be true of all of them. What's that?
God's holy.
Okay. Okay, well, what's the difference, though, between... Oh, okay. Jerry?
The answer is angels don't procreate.
Okay. Angels don't procreate, right? But men do. Now, when God made the angels, how many did he make? Don't put a number to it, because I don't think we know the number, but did he make some, all, or... Jen? Okay. He made them all, and he made them all at one time, okay? Now, with man, he didn't make all men at one time, did he? He made just Adam and Eve, right? And from Adam and Eve, all the rest of mankind came. Now, the thing that God did, though, is that he put both of them, both groups, on probation. He tested both groups, okay? He put, of course, Adam and Eve in the garden, and he gave them the test not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And because all mankind could not be present at one time because of procreation, he actually put the whole human race on trial in Adam and Eve, okay? And Adam's decision, of course, had consequences for all of his posterity. But with the angels, they were all present at one time, and there was still a test. And the test was whether or not they were going to remain faithful to the Lord or fall away from the Lord. Now, the elect angels remained faithful to the Lord, but the fallen angels fell away from the Lord. And what made the difference between them? Okay, why did one group fall and the other group didn't fall? There can really only be one answer to that. I mean, we could say from an Arminian perspective, free will, brother, it's free will. And they all were free to make their choice. They all made their choice. But they were all, in this case, like Adam and Eve. They were perfectly good, disposed only toward the good. That's all they wanted. They were holy angels. But some of them chose evil, and some of them chose to remain faithful to God. Some of them chose to rebel with Satan. Some of them didn't, right? It refers to election, and of course with election, the Lord, at least we have to believe this. There's no specific text in Scripture that says this, except it does call them the elect angels, which means that in some sense they were chosen by God. God chose them to remain faithful, which means God gave them the grace to remain faithful, whereas the others, He didn't give that additional grace, as it were, and they fell away. And I think when you understand that, you can understand why Edwards believes that if God had given, for instance, Adam additional grace, Adam would not have fallen away.